Hi, this is Mike Yant, and this is our weekly review of our daily Bible reading. And so, welcome. I think I've got everything turned on that's supposed to be turned on. And I was looking earlier this morning at what we need to review. So this week we read Exodus chapters 21 through 27. And that included some, tedious readings. So when I was reviewing, I went to Exodus 21 to sort of refresh my mind about what we'd cover this weekend. So I start reading this. Now these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him son, and so it goes. And as I thought about this, it occurred to me that this is a good time. Let me try to get this microphone out of the picture there, so you're not distracted by that. This would be a good time to talk about the law of Moses and what we see happening in the New Testament. And these sort of detailed laws, for example, what do you do with a slave? Well, for us living today, these things don't have applicability for us. In the first place, most of us aren't Hebrews. We're not, physical descendants of Abraham, so it doesn't apply to us in that way. I mean, if we'd lived back then, we'd be one of these other nations around there. We'd be Philistines or Hittites or something else. So it doesn't relate to us. But what was happening in New Testament times with Jesus was it was changing to where it no longer applied to the Jews either. And that was a big change for them to go through. We lose sight today of just how Jewish the New Testament was and is. Now, when I first started reading the Bible, I was around age 27. I grew up Roman Catholic. We knew about the Bible. There was a Bible in our house, but we didn't read it. And so I had sort of this perception, okay, you got Catholics and you got Protestants and they read the Bible, but the Bible seems to be more important to Protestants, and I'm not really sure what they do with it. But as Catholics, we got stuff they don't have. We got the Stations of the Cross, we got the Mass, we got the incense and all kinds of stuff like that. And the Protestant world really seemed unusual to me. But then the Jewish world was even more distant. I didn't have a lot of Jewish friends. There weren't a lot of, there were Jewish people in our town, but I really kind of wasn't aware of them. My parents never talked about Jews. And so when I hear, in fact, even today, when I hear people talking about, well, so-and-so is Jewish, I'm like, oh, yeah? How do you know? And it's just something that it was just never impressed on me what that big difference was. But I did have the sense that religiously speaking, they were very different from Catholics and Protestants. We knew they didn't read the New Testament. And so for that reason, I never thought of the New Testament as Jewish. But all these books in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, all the way through to Revelation, they were all written by Jews. The only exception to that seems to be Luke and Acts, which Acts was written by Luke, and Luke was a Gentile. He was a co-worker of Paul. So he's the only non-Jew who wrote a book in the New Testament. And of course, all the original 12 apostles were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles, was himself not a Gentile. He was a Jew. In fact, he was a Pharisee. He was that Jewish. He was just really imbued both physically and intellectually with the Jewish mindset. And for a Jew living in the first century, in the time of Jesus, the law of Moses this is how we please God, because God had given the law to Moses, it had been passed down from generation to generation. Israel had not been, for a time they had obeyed it, and that led to the great kingdom of David and even greater kingdom of Solomon. But they had fallen away from God and been driven off the land. And so now here they are in the first century, they're under Roman oppression, and they just wanted to obey that law of Moses because that's what God gave them. In other words, this is our salvation. We've got to get back and obey this law of Moses thing, including what's here in Exodus 21 about how you treat slaves. But instead, Rome had dominion over them, and so they had to obey Roman law. Now, Rome would let them do certain religious things on their own, but they could not do anything unless it was something that the Romans allowed them to do. And so they saw this as a real problem. So the Pharisees, they were all about how do we obey the law of Moses. Even the Sadducees, they were the same way. We got to obey the law of Moses. And there were other Jewish sects, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but those were the two main ones. And they were all about how you keep the law of Moses. So Jesus comes along, and he's showing a new way, and what it means is that going forward, these kind of laws like we read won't apply anymore. And Jesus and his apostles had the hardest time getting the Jewish people, the Jewish believers, I'm not talking about unbelievers, but the Jewish believers in Jesus to understand that the law as it was originally given doesn't matter anymore. It's now all about the law of Jesus, not about the law of Moses. And this whole issue just comes up over and over again. We see it in the book of Acts. We see it in other places. And in fact, it basically explains the reason for the existence of the book of Romans and the book of Galatians. And I want to talk a little bit about both of those today. Because if you don't understand this argument, this uncertainty, this confusion about the law of Moses, then the book of Romans and the book of Galatians it'll be hard for them to make sense to you, because it was that controversy that drove most of the content in both of those books. So, the first point that Jesus would make and his apostles would try to make is that the law was temporary. Now, it's easier for us to see that it's temporary because we're looking back on it. We're in the 21st century. We're looking back 21 centuries to the first century, and we can see, yes, the law of Moses was temporary. There's a lot of ways we know that, but one of them is this passage from Exodus that we just read, Exodus 21, how you treat a slave. We live in the 21st century. We don't allow slaves anymore. We don't have that. So obviously, the law of Moses was not intended to last forever. It would become obsolete over time. Now, a lot of things work to make slavery obsolete in the world, but the most obvious example is the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution, machines come along, and all of a sudden they can do stuff better and cheaper than people. And so you don't need as much manual labor as you used to need. And at times, the Industrial Revolution actually creates new problems, because then it's, well, what do you do with the people that need work? When I was in India on business a number of years ago, some business associates took me to one of the big Indian companies. It was one of the top 3 IT companies in India at the time. I don't remember which one it was. Let's see, Wipro was one of them. Emphasis was another one. I can't remember. But anyway, we were in Bangalore, India, which is a city where it's sort of like their Silicon Valley, or at least it was at the time. And they take me to this company's campus where their buildings are, and it was enormous, and it was modern. I mean, it looked like Microsoft or any other big technology company that you'd see. In fact, it had some things that looked even more modern. But yet, while I was there, in the midst of that campus, in fact, they even had like a sort of like a amphitheater kind of thing where they'd have meetings of employees. And I saw this group of about a dozen Indian guys, carrying this big rock. And just seeing them juxtaposed on this scene of this ultra-modern campus with all these, beautiful buildings, just was odd. They just looked so out of place. And I remember asking the guys that told me, why is that? That just looks so strange. Why don't they get a backhoe or some type of machinery to carry that rock? Why you got 12 guys, carrying that rock like it's in the 1500s or something? And they explained to me that there was a good reason for it, and that was that there's just a lot of poor people in India. I mean, poor people in India are not like poor people here. Poor people here are not hurting too bad. They usually got food to eat, they got clothes to wear, sometimes they even got, big screen TV and other stuff. In India, when you're poor, you're really poor. And it was a way to give people jobs. And yeah, they could have gone out and gotten a machine to do that, but there were certain things that they left for these people to do, and that way they could earn money and they could go back and they could support their families. And me, once again, kind of like a modern know-it-all, didn't see that, but they explained it to me, and I see it. So the Industrial Revolution, yeah, it can do a lot of things, and it eliminates the need for slavery, but sometimes it can eliminate jobs too. And so we need to give more thought to how do we keep people employed, and how do we train them with new skills so they can have new jobs. But a lot of people today, especially atheists, if you talk to them, they'll even point to the Bible. Well, the Bible's got slavery in it, and how can you follow a God that believes in slavery? The law of Moses was given for a period of time. It was in pre-industrial times, and this was the way people behaved, and God's purpose was try to regulate slavery. It's the same way today we try to regulate certain things that maybe aren't that good for people, whether it's the lottery or smoking or even in some states now marijuana, alcohol. You got all these things that are not necessarily good for people, but laws try to regulate it. And that's what God had. God had laws to try to regulate how people were going to live then. He couldn't tell everybody to live like Jesus because no one had ever seen anybody live like Jesus. And you couldn't have convinced them, apart from seeing it, that it actually could be done. And so, so the reason that modern man does not practice slavery is not because we're more moral than our ancestors. Oh yeah, we would never do what they did. That's just so arrogant and foolish. The reason that we don't have slavery is we don't have to have it. It doesn't. We don't need it. And when I say we need it, I'm not just talking about the people that own slaves. I'm talking about the people that were slaves. People that were slaves in some of those situations were glad to be a slave. It was a way to get food to eat, to be taken care of, to have a roof over your head at night. And not every owner of a slave was cruel. So I don't want to get bogged down on the whole idea of slavery, but I'm using it as an example to show a couple of things. One is that the reason we don't have slavery today is not because we're all that moral. It's because we got a bunch of machines and we got washing machines. So we don't have to enslave people to go down to the river and beat our clothes on the rocks to clean them. And the other thing is to use it as an example to point out that the law of Moses was intended to be a temporary set of instructions for Israel until the Messiah, Jesus, would come. So when Jesus did come, and when he was raised from the dead, and now the apostles are preaching the gospel, and they're, in every place they go, they're going to the Jews first, because in the beginning it was all about Jews. In fact, you read the book of Acts, which covers the time from the time Jesus was raised from the dead until maybe 20, 30 years later when Paul arrives in Rome. The first 10 chapters, there's not a single Gentile believing. They're all Jews. It's not until chapter 10 that Peter gets the word from Jesus to go preach to a Roman centurion, and they bring him in and baptize him, and he becomes a disciple. So the big question that comes up then is, okay, do these Gentiles have to keep the law of Moses? Because the Jews had not yet absorbed, the Jews who believed had not yet absorbed that they don't have to keep all this law of Moses stuff anymore. They didn't know how to transition to this new covenant. They were still living under this old covenant. And yes, they repented, they came to Jesus, they wanted to do what the Messiah said, but they assumed that Messiah would want them to keep the law of Moses. Well, he did, but he wanted them to keep it according to their heart, the spirit, like we've been talking about. And it took a while for that idea to take hold, and in the meantime, you had all this confusion. So in Acts 15, they've got a big council, they've got everybody together, and the Jews who had believed in Jerusalem were fussing at Paul and Barnabas and telling them, hey, you got to tell these Gentiles to keep the law. They can't just do whatever they want to do. They got to keep the law of Moses. And Paul was trying to tell them, no, they're keeping the law of Christ, which is love in all things, and husbands love your wives, and parents train your children, and on and on and on, like we read about in the letters. And they had to send out a letter to all the churches and tell them, hey, look, the Gentiles don't have to do that. But that still left a lot of confusion about how much the Jews ought to have to do it. And so you've got this tension all through the New Testament between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. I'm not talking now about tension between Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, so there was tension there too. But I'm talking about within the believing community, you had believing Jews and believing Gentiles, and this whole issue of, okay, the Gentiles don't have to keep the law of Moses. What should the Jewish Christians be doing? And that gave rise, first of all, to the letter to the Galatians, which was probably written, most scholars say think it was written around 50 AD, which would have been about 20, 25 years after Jesus was raised from the dead. Did I do the math right? 50, 30, 15 or 20 years after Jesus was raised from the dead. And Galatia was this region in Asia Minor, what we today call Turkey. And some teachers had gone through there and told them, first of all, Paul had gone through there and he preached the gospel. And there were a number of people who believed. But then after he went through and left, then these false teachers came in and told the people, hey, this guy Paul, he's misleading you. You need to keep the law of Moses. Yes, it's good that you believed in Jesus, and you should believe in Jesus, but you got to keep this law of Moses thing too. So you need to circumcise all you kids, and you need to start keeping, go back and read the law of Moses and keep all these commandments and so on. And Paul got real upset about it. In fact, in Galatians, in the first chapter, he says, verse 6, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even though we or an angel of heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you have received, let him be accursed. But these are strong words, let him be accursed. And Paul was trying to tell these people that this was not about keeping the law of Moses. Now, part of what makes this confusing to us is that a lot of times in the epistles, or even in the book of Acts, or even in the Gospels, anywhere in the New Testament, they're talking about the law of Moses. A lot of times they just say the law, and it would mean the law of Moses. Didn't always mean exactly that, but a lot of times it meant, if they said the law, it meant the law of Moses. And so for example, in Galatians 4:21, Paul says, tell me, you who want to be under law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise. This contains an allegory, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. And he goes on, and I recognize this can be confusing for some of you. But I'm not going to try to unravel all that now. The point is that you can see here as an example, Paul is telling these people, look, you want to be under law? There's a difference here. There's a difference between being under law and under grace, being under the old covenant and the new covenant, being under the law of Moses and the law of Christ. We who live today, we're not under the law of Moses, we're under the law of Christ. We are not living in the old covenant, we're living in the new covenant. We're not living under law, we're living under grace. Now, grace doesn't mean, hey, we can do whatever we want to do. There is a law in grace. It's the law of love, loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves, and being willing even to lay down our lives for our neighbor. Living our lives as a sacrifice, a daily holy sacrifice to the Lord. Living every day as part of the eternal Sabbath in which everything we do is for God. Jesus died and rose again from the dead so that those who live, that is us, might live for him who died and rose again on our behalf. So we're living for someone else. We're no longer living for ourselves. So the law of Christ, in that sense, makes a much greater claim on our lives, because it claims not just our physical behavior like the law of Moses did, but it claims our thoughts, our emotions, our words, everything we say, think, and do, and everything we are. Jesus lays claim to it. So this is the argument that's taking place in the book of Galatians. And sometime you might want to just sit down and just read the whole book of Galatians. It's only 6 chapters. It wouldn't take you long to read it. And read it with that in mind, that this is about an argument about whether believers should have to keep the law of Moses or not. And as I say, much easier for us to see how clear-cut the issue is living 21 centuries later, because they looked around and slaves were just part of the economy. There were different levels of slaves, and I'm just picking the slavery example. There's lots of other examples in the books of Moses as well. But the point is that they lived in the first century. They lived much closer to the time of Moses, which was around 1500 BC. So only about 1,500 years between Moses and Jesus. But it's been almost 2,000 years since then. And of course, a lot more change has happened, because when Jesus came, it opened up the world to all kinds of new possibilities. And because the kingdom of God came, we were able to have things like the Industrial Revolution and all sorts of other things that have taken place since then. So technologically, we're advancing, although morally we still keep going in the same circles that we always have been. There's nothing new under the sun. We may not have slavery, but we got a bunch of bad things they didn't have. So anyway, that's the book of Galatians. Paul is speaking very forcefully in it, and he's trying to take these people that he originally taught the gospel to, and who have been misled by these false teachers, and he's trying to get them back on the right track. Now, I just looked at the clock. I've only got a couple more minutes. So let me say briefly about Romans. Romans is much longer. It's 16 chapters. And the key to the book of Romans is in the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And if you understand the beginning and the end, then you can, you got a chance of understanding the middle. But if you just start at the beginning and try to read through, it is just very easy to get bogged down. But in the first chapter, verse 16, Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." Now, if you go to the end of the book, and you read especially chapter 16, he starts off, "I commend you to our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church which is at Cenchrea, that you receive her in the Lord." Then he goes on in verse 3, "Greet Prisca and Aquila." In verse 6, "Greet Mary." And 7, "Greet Andronicus and Junius." And 8, "Greet Ampliatus." All these people, I mean, lots of people he's giving these personal greetings to. Now, he had never been to Rome. So how does he know all these people? Well, he's met them. The Romans got mad at the Jews. I think it's around AD 48. The Emperor Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. So they get sent all around the Mediterranean world. They're fleeing that. And Paul met a lot of them in his travels. And he's going to come and see them. And he's speaking to the church in Rome. Rome is the New York City of its day. It's the most important city in the world, biggest city. And the whole book of Romans is talking about how the gospel works for both the Jews and the Greeks, or Gentiles. He uses Greek as a synonym for Gentile. And he's going back and forth, and that's why the book gets so confusing, especially chapters 1 through 9, or 1 through 11, and then 9 through 11 are particularly difficult. People stumble all over that. By the time you get to 12, Paul starts talking about basic things that apply to everybody, how we're supposed to live our lives as a holy sacrifice to God. But up until that time, primarily chapters 2 through 11, he's 1 minute he's talking about how it works how the gospel works for the Jews, and the next minute he's talking about how it works for the Gentiles. And he's trying to speak to both audiences, because the tension, he's trying to resolve the tension with a letter before he ever gets there. He's trying to settle that issue, and he knows that some of those people there, know, "Hey, Paul, we've heard about you, yes, we've met you." I mean, these people had met him that I referred to, but there's a lot of people that are believers in Rome who hadn't met him. And he's figuring, they're thinking, well, if you got the right doctrine, are you telling Gentiles and Jews they don't have to keep Moses' law? So that's the kind of controversy that's the backdrop for that letter. And that's why when you and I read the Old Testament, we're looking for, okay, what's the spiritual reality? What are the spiritual truths that need to be drawn out of that? Because to know how to treat a slave and how long you ought to own one and what you ought to do after the 6th year, that's of no interest to us, because it's of no interest to God. And I think over the years, a lot of Christians have understood that, whether explicitly or intuitively. I mean, a lot of the abolition movement in 19th century America was led by Christians who believed that slavery was wrong. It was something that God would redeem us from. This is not unlike the issue of divorce. The Pharisees came to Jesus one time and said, "Is it lawful?" He said, "Moses said we could divorce our wives. Is that lawful or not?" Well, Jesus was teaching you shouldn't divorce. You need to get married once. That's it. And they were saying, "Well, did Moses say it was okay?" And Jesus said, "Because of the hardness of your hearts." So there's a lot of stuff in this Old Testament that's there because of the hardness of people's hearts. And in the New Covenant, God's expecting something more from us anyway, something that is eternal, that works in any age. I hope that helps you when you're reading Romans and Galatians. And remember always, the New Testament is a Jewish book. Christianity is a sect of the Jewish religion. That's what it is. It's not something opposed to Judaism. It is a sect of Judaism, a subset of Judaism, if you will. And you and I are fortunate enough to be a part of it because our faith is in Jesus and our love is for him. And we can thank God for the understanding that he's given us. Until next time, God bless you.